The delivery room, usually a place of unrestrained joy and triumphant first cries, held a subtle discord that settled into Eleanor's heart like a persistent, low hum. The tiny bundle placed in her arms was perfect in every visible way. 10 delicate fingers, 10 equally small toes, a fuzz of dark hair against a surprisingly defined scalp. Her husband, Thomas, stood beside her, his face a mixture of awe and exhaustion, his hand a comforting weight on her shoulder. The initial days were a blur of feeding, sleepless nights, and the overwhelming, all-consuming love that motherhood promised. Yet, amidst this expected chaos and burgeoning affection, Eleanor couldn't shake a feeling of displacement. It wasn't a lack of love for the child she held, for young Clara quickly burrowed her way into every corner of Eleanor's being. It was something more akin to an echo in an empty chamber, a whisper just beyond her hearing, a persistent sense that a vital piece of her own self was elsewhere, unbound and unknown. Years spun into a tapestry of scraped knees, bedtime stories whispered in the dark, and the proud milestones of Clara's young life. Eleanor poured her heart and soul into raising her daughter, celebrating every achievement, comforting every tear. From the first wobbly steps to the confident pronouncements of a budding intellect, Clara was the center of their world. To any observer, they were the quintessential happy family, a portrait of domestic bliss framed by laughter and shared experiences. Yet, for Eleanor, the undercurrent persisted. It manifested in quiet moments, often triggered by the most innocuous of things: a melody on the radio, the sight of a particular shade of blue, or even the way another mother interacted with her child in the park. These instances would send a ripple of inexplicable sadness through her, a sharp pang that left her momentarily breathless and questioning the very foundations of her happiness. She would often find herself gazing at Clara, searching for some intangible connection that felt not quite complete. It was a disquieting thought, one she immediately banished, guilt washing over her in icy waves. How could she, her own child, evoke such a feeling? Was she somehow flawed as a mother, incapable of fully embracing the miracle she had been given? She confided in Thomas occasionally, speaking of a vague unease, a sense of something missing that she couldn't articulate. Thomas, ever practical and loving, would reassure her, attributing it to postpartum hormones that had lingered longer than expected, or the natural anxieties of motherhood. He encouraged her to focus on the present, on the tangible joy that Clara brought into their lives, and she tried desperately to heed his words. But the feeling was insidious, a shadow that stretched and contracted with the passing years. It would lie dormant for periods, lulled by the warmth of family life, only to resurface unexpectedly, triggered by an image in a magazine of a mother and daughter with an uncanny resemblance, or a news story about a long-lost relative reunited. Each instance would reignite the quiet ache in her chest, the persistent whisper of something being amiss. She started noticing subtle differences between herself and Clara, a lack of shared physical traits that extended beyond simple genetics. Her own dark curly hair was mirrored in her parents and siblings, while Clara's was stubbornly straight and fair, like Thomas's family. Their mannerisms, their innate preferences seemed to diverge in subtle but noticeable ways. Eleanor, a passionate reader with a quiet intensity, watched Clara's boundless energy and love for the outdoors with a mixture of pride and a faint sense of unfamiliarity. These observations, though fleeting and often dismissed as the natural variations within a family, began to accumulate, forming a disquieting pattern in the back of Eleanor's mind. She would find herself dwelling on the day of Clara's birth, the sterile environment of the hospital, the hurried efficiency of the nurses. Snippets of conversations overheard in her hazy post-delivery state would resurface. A hushed apology from a nurse for a minor mix-up with paperwork, a fleeting moment of confusion in the nursery. At the time, these fragments had been insignificant, lost in the overwhelming tide of new motherhood. Now, however, they took on a different hue, imbued with a sense of foreboding that Eleanor struggled to ignore. The lingering emptiness wasn't a rejection of Clara. It was a profound yearning for something unknown, a feeling that a fundamental piece of her own story was missing. It was the echo of a heart that instinctively knew a part of itself was elsewhere, a biological imperative that transcended the conscious love she held for her daughter. This unexplained ache was the first subtle crack in the facade of their perfect family, a silent testament to a truth that lay dormant, waiting for the right moment to shatter their world and piece it back together in an entirely unexpected way. It was the quiet prelude to a storm of emotions, the gentle whisper of destiny beginning its inexorable call. While Eleanor grappled with an unspoken void, miles away, across the bustling sprawl of the city, a young girl named Isabelle was growing up in a world entirely different, yet oddly similar in its undercurrents of subtle dissonance. Isabelle lived with Maria and Roberto, a warm, boisterous couple who adored her with every fiber of their being. Their home was filled with the aroma of Maria's home-cooked meals, the lively chatter of family gatherings, and the constant hum of Roberto's classic rock music. Isabelle was their pride and joy, the bright star around whom their universe revolved. They showered her with affection, encouraged her every endeavor, and celebrated her smallest victories with unbridled enthusiasm. To them, she was their miracle, a gift they had long yearned for, and they raised her with a boundless love that was palpable in every shared moment. Yet despite this loving environment, Isabelle carried a peculiar sense of being an observer in her own life, as if a vital piece of her identity remained just beyond her grasp. Maria and Roberto were effervescent, expressive, and deeply rooted in their cultural traditions, their every gesture large and open. Isabelle, on the other hand, possessed a quieter, more introspective nature. She found solace in books, losing herself for hours in fictional worlds, a stark contrast to her adoptive parents' preference for animated conversations and community events. While Maria and Roberto thrived in the midst of vibrant social circles, Isabelle often preferred the solitude of her own thoughts, sketching in her notebook or writing poems that no one else ever saw. These differences, initially dismissed as mere personality quirks, grew more pronounced as she entered her teenage years, creating a subtle, almost imperceptible chasm between her and the family she cherished. She bore little physical resemblance to either Maria or Roberto. Her hair, a rich dark brown, curled softly around her face, unlike Maria's sleek straight black hair or Roberto's receding hairline. Her eyes, a striking shade of hazel, held a thoughtful intensity that contrasted with Maria's sparkling, expressive dark eyes and Roberto's kind, crinkling ones. Relatives and family friends would occasionally comment on it, often with good-natured jokes about who she really took after. Isabelle would smile politely, but inside, a seed of unease would take root. She'd spend hours staring at her reflection, tracing the lines of her face, searching for a hint of her parents in her own features, always coming up empty. It wasn't a source of distress, not truly, but rather a persistent, low-level hum of curiosity that never quite faded. She loved Maria and Roberto unconditionally, truly, but there was always that quiet question echoing in the recesses of her mind. Who am I, really? Her artistic talents, in particular, seemed to bloom from an unknown source. While Maria's hands were skilled in the kitchen and Roberto's in carpentry, Isabelle's fingers yearned for charcoal and canvas. She felt an innate connection to art, a compulsion to create that felt almost ancestral. It was a stark contrast to the practical, grounded pursuits of her adoptive family, who, while supportive, couldn't quite grasp the depth of her artistic drive. They admired her drawings, of course, hanging them proudly on the fridge, but they didn't share her profound emotional connection to the act of creation itself. This subtle disconnect, this feeling of being an outlier, further solidified her quiet conviction that a part of her lineage, a piece of her intrinsic self, lay elsewhere, waiting to be discovered. There were moments, too, of inexplicable connection to strangers, fleeting encounters that left her with a sense of déjà vu, a feeling of having met someone before, even when it was clearly impossible. Once in a crowded bookstore, she brushed past a woman with strikingly similar dark curly hair to her own, and a wave of almost painful recognition washed over her, making her pause and turn. The woman was already gone, lost in the throng, but the moment lingered, a strange imprint on her consciousness. These were not conscious thoughts of being swapped, not yet, but rather the unconscious stirrings of a soul reaching out, seeking its true origins. Isabelle's journey was one of quiet self-discovery within the embrace of a loving, albeit fundamentally different, family. She navigated her childhood and adolescence with grace, absorbing the love given to her while nurturing a silent, growing awareness that her own unique path had perhaps begun on a different road. Her life, though rich and full, was lived in parallel to another, an unseen thread connecting her to a history she didn't know existed. The emotional landscape of her upbringing was one of profound affection, interwoven with the subtle, persistent whispers of an unknown heritage, preparing her, unwittingly, for a revelation that would shatter her understanding of herself and her world, and ultimately lead her to the echo of her true heart. The universe, in its intricate and often unfathomable design, sometimes orchestrates moments of profound significance disguised as ordinary happenstance. For Eleanor and Isabelle, this moment wasn't a grand cinematic revelation, but rather a subtle, almost imperceptible tremor in the fabric of their everyday lives, a gentle whisper of destiny beginning its inexorable work. It unfolded not in a dramatic setting, but within the mundane, bustling aisles of a local farmer's market, a place both women frequented, drawn by the allure of fresh produce and artisanal goods. Eleanor, navigating the vibrant chaos of the market with her now teenage daughter Clara, was in her element, methodically selecting ripe tomatoes and crisp greens. Clara, with her characteristic effervescence, was off exploring a stall selling handmade jewelry, a temporary reprieve from her mother's meticulous shopping. Eleanor, momentarily distracted by a particularly fragrant display of lavender, felt a sudden, inexplicable pull, a magnetic sensation that made the hairs on her arms prickle. She looked up, her gaze sweeping across the crowded market, her eyes landing on a young woman standing a few stalls away. The young woman had her back to Eleanor, but something in her posture, the way she tilted her head slightly as she examined a bunch of wildflowers, resonated with an almost painful familiarity. As the woman turned to speak to the vendor, a lock of dark, curly hair fell across her forehead, and Eleanor felt a jolt, as if struck by an invisible current. It was the same shade, the same texture as her own, a trait that had always felt uniquely hers, conspicuously absent in her beloved Clara. Then the young woman laughed, a quiet, melodic sound, and in that instant, Eleanor's world seemed to tilt. The shape of her mouth, the curve of her smile, the thoughtful intensity in her hazel eyes, it was like looking at a ghost of herself, a younger, brighter version. A wave of dizziness washed over Eleanor, forcing her to lean against a nearby table for support. It was a recognition so profound it bypassed logic. A primal chord struck deep within her very being. This wasn't just a resemblance, it was an echo, loud and clear, of the missing piece she had unknowingly carried for so long. She didn't know why she felt it, only that the inexplicable ache she had carried for years suddenly had a face. Meanwhile, Isabelle, immersed in the beauty of the wildflowers, had just paid for a small bouquet. She felt a strange warmth on the back of her neck, a sensation of being watched, but not unpleasantly so. As she turned to leave the stall, her eyes drifted across the throng of people and landed on a woman with an intense, almost longing gaze directed squarely at her. The woman's dark, curly hair framed a face etched with a familiar sadness, a quiet dignity that resonated with something deep inside Isabelle. There was an uncanny sense of recognition, a feeling that this woman was not a stranger, but someone she had known or was meant to know all her life. Isabelle's heart fluttered in her chest, a nervous excitement mixed with an inexplicable sense of homecoming. It was the same feeling she sometimes got when she lost herself in her art, a sense of rightness, of being exactly where she was meant to be, yet amplified 100-fold. She felt an urge, raw and undeniable, to approach this woman, to speak to her, to understand the magnetic pull that bound them. For a fleeting moment, their eyes locked across the bustling market. In that shared gaze, a silent conversation unfolded, a profound, wordless acknowledgement of a connection that defied explanation. It was a brief, almost ethereal communion, a moment suspended in time amidst the everyday chaos. Then, Clara, returning from the jewelry stall, playfully tugged on Eleanor's arm, pulling her back into the present. Eleanor blinked. The intense vision of the young woman momentarily fractured. When she looked back, Isabelle was already walking away, disappearing into the crowd, the small bouquet of wildflowers a splash of color against her retreating form. Isabelle, too, felt the thread of connection snap as she was jostled by passers-by. She glanced back, but the woman with the searching eyes was gone, swallowed by the market's ebb and flow. A profound sense of loss, disproportionate to the briefness of the encounter, washed over her. It was as if she had been on the precipice of a revelation, only for it to slip through her fingers. Both women were left with a powerful, lingering impression, an indelible mark on their consciousness. Eleanor felt an urgent, almost desperate need to find the young woman again, a conviction that this encounter was not random, but a signpost pointing towards a truth she had unknowingly been seeking. Isabelle, on her part, felt an unsettling familiarity, a sense that the woman in the market held a key to the questions that had quietly echoed in her own heart for so long. The whispers of destiny had spoken, subtle yet undeniable, setting the stage for the dramatic unraveling that was to come. The fleeting glimpse at the farmer's market, though brief, had irrevocably altered the landscape of Eleanor's inner world. The inexplicable ache, once a vague whisper, had transformed into a resounding call, echoing the features of the young woman she'd seen. She found herself obsessing over the encounter, replaying it countless times in her mind, each detail taking on monumental significance. The dark, curly hair, the hazel eyes, the thoughtful curve of the mouth. It was like looking into a mirror of her past, a face that Clara, for all her beauty and Eleanor's profound love, simply did not reflect in the same visceral way. The guilt that followed these thoughts was immense, a heavy cloak she wore constantly, yet it couldn't extinguish the fierce, growing conviction that the market encounter was more than just a coincidence. Driven by an instinct she couldn't ignore, Eleanor began a quiet, almost clandestine investigation. Her first stop was the hospital where Clara had been born. She claimed she needed old vaccination records for a school enrollment, a plausible excuse to revisit the archives. The hospital, a large, bustling facility, had undergone several system upgrades over the years, making old records a labyrinthine challenge to access. She spent hours, then days, poring over dusty files and microfiches, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and desperate hope. The nurses and administrative staff, polite but harried, offered little help beyond the official channels. It was a tedious, frustrating process, yielding nothing but official paperwork confirming Clara's birth, her name, her weight, and Eleanor's own details. Everything appeared perfectly in order, a stark contrast to the burgeoning chaos in Eleanor's mind. Just as despair began to settle in, a chance remark from a kindly retired administrative assistant, now volunteering, offered a tiny thread of hope. "Oh, that was a busy month," the woman mused, peering at an old logbook from the year Clara was born. "We had that small incident, you know, with the power outage during that big storm. Messed up a few of the electronic charts for a bit. caused a bit of a manual backlog in the nursery. Nothing major, mind you, just a bit of a kerfuffle and a power outage. A manual backlog in the nursery. Eleanor's blood ran cold. The seemingly innocuous kerfuffle now felt like a giant flashing neon sign. She pressed for more details, her voice barely a whisper, but the assistant could only recall the general inconvenience, not specific patient impacts. Meanwhile, Isabelle, too, had been unable to shake the image of the woman at the market. That profound sense of recognition, the unsettling feeling that she had glimpsed a part of her own missing history, persisted. She started paying closer attention to her own features, tracing the lines of her hand, examining the curve of her ear. The differences between her and Maria and Roberto, once subtle and easily dismissed, now seemed glaringly apparent. She loved them fiercely and unequivocally, but a new question had taken root. Who else was she? One evening, as Maria recounted stories of Isabelle's infancy, including a humorous anecdote about a slightly mixed-up hospital blanket that caused a momentary confusion with another baby in the nursery, Isabelle felt a sudden chill. Mixed up? How so, Mama? She asked, her voice surprisingly steady. Maria laughed it off. Oh, just for a second. 2 babies with similar names, a busy nurse. Nothing serious, they sorted it out right away. But for Isabelle, it wasn't nothing. It was a tremor, a tiny crack in the foundation of her understanding. The true revelation for Eleanor came not from official records, but from a deeply personal, almost desperate act. After weeks of fruitless searching, consumed by the gnawing doubt, she decided, against all conventional wisdom, to pursue a DNA test. It was a harrowing decision, fraught with the fear of confirming her worst suspicions, or worse, finding nothing and being left with the lingering torment. She chose a discreet, reputable service, providing samples for herself and Clara, feigning curiosity about their ethnic heritage. The wait for the results was agonizing, each passing day an eternity of nervous anticipation. When the email finally arrived, its subject line stark and unforgiving, Eleanor's hands trembled so violently she almost dropped her phone. The results were a categorical, brutal confirmation of her deepest fear. There was no direct maternal match between her and Clara. The percentage of shared DNA was that of a more distant relative, not a mother and daughter. The world spun on its axis. The lingering emptiness wasn't a figment of her imagination. It was a devastating, undeniable truth. Clara was not her biological daughter. The child she had loved, nurtured, and raised with every fiber of her being, the child she believed was born of her body, was not. The shock was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Tears streamed down her face, a mixture of profound grief for the years of unconscious deception and an overwhelming, desperate longing for the child who was hers, somewhere out in the world. The pieces of the puzzle, the subtle differences, the inexplicable ache, the brief hospital kerfuffle, the woman at the market, they all crashed together in a terrifying, undeniable picture. Her baby had been swapped. Simultaneously, through a combination of her adoptive parents' casual mentions and her own research into family trees, Isabelle began to stumble upon inconsistencies. A distant cousin on Roberto's side, a genealogist, had created a detailed family tree, and while Isabelle fit perfectly into their lives emotionally, her physical traits simply didn't align with generations of the family's strong, consistent genetic markers. Driven by a growing unease, she too decided to do a discreet DNA test, claiming it was for fun, to explore her heritage. When her results came back, the lack of a strong match to Maria and Roberto was a shock, but not entirely a surprise. What was a surprise was a series of potential, incredibly close matches in a different branch of the database. Matches that pointed to an unknown biological mother, a woman named Eleanor. The name resonated with the woman from the market, an almost uncanny link. The whispers of destiny had ceased. In their place, a thunderous revelation had shattered both their worlds, setting them on an undeniable collision course towards the truth. The revelation struck Eleanor like a bolt of lightning, leaving her simultaneously shattered and incandescent with a purpose she hadn't known she lacked. Clara, her beloved daughter, was not biologically hers. The truth, raw and unyielding, left her gasping for air, yet intertwined with the searing pain was a fierce, almost primal urge to find the child who was. The DNA results, cold and scientific, were now a map. They didn't just negate a relationship, they pointed towards another. The name Isabelle, a potential high-percentage match, vibrated in her mind, hauntingly familiar from the fleeting encounter at the market. That moment, once a perplexing flicker, now burned with the clarity of destiny. Eleanor's first steps were faltering, tentative, fraught with an overwhelming mix of emotions. There was the profound grief for the life she thought she had, the agonizing awareness of years lost, and the terrifying prospect of what this truth meant for Clara, who was, in every sense that mattered, her child. How could she explain this to her daughter? How could she shatter Clara's world in the same way hers had been? This fear was a paralyzing weight. Yet stronger than the fear was an irresistible pull, a desperate yearning for the daughter she had never known, the one whose existence had only just been revealed. The first outreach was cautious, a carefully crafted message through the DNA service, a neutral, open-ended inquiry. She typed and retyped the words, trying to convey a profound truth without causing immediate alarm or offense. I believe we may share a close familial connection. I'm exploring my family history and felt compelled to reach out. It felt inadequate, monumental, and terrifying all at once. Meanwhile, Isabelle received Eleanor's message. Her own DNA results had left her in a state of stunned disbelief. Maria and Roberto, her parents, her world, were not her biological family. The realization was a tidal wave of conflicting emotions, confusion, a deep sense of betrayal, even though she knew it wasn't intentional, and an aching curiosity about her true origins. The name Eleanor, alongside her own results, had sent a jolt of recognition through her. The woman from the market, the one with the familiar sadness in her eyes, the dark, curly hair. Could it be? When the message popped up, Isabelle's hands trembled as she read it. It was formal, polite, but beneath the measured words, she sensed an urgency, a plea. Her heart pounded. This was it, the answer to the quiet questions that had echoed within her for a lifetime. Their first direct communication was a telephone call, a scheduled video call, chosen as a compromise between the immediacy of voice and the need for visual confirmation. Both women prepared for it with a mixture of dread and feverish anticipation. Eleanor, dressed in her best blouse, sat before her laptop, her breath catching in her throat as the screen flickered to life. Isabelle, on her end, felt a prickle of tears as she saw the familiar face from the market, undeniably older, yet with that same haunting expression. "Hello," Eleanor began, her voice a fragile whisper, barely recognizable to herself. "Isabelle?" Isabelle nodded, her own voice thick with emotion. "Yes. And you're Eleanor?" The conversation that followed was an intricate dance of tentative steps, profound apologies, and an overwhelming rush of shared emotion. Eleanor, with agonizing care, explained her journey, the persistent feeling, the DNA test, the shocking confirmation. She spoke of the day Clara was born, the minor hospital kerfuffle that now seemed anything but minor. Isabelle listened, her eyes widening, tears silently tracing paths down her cheeks. The pieces of her own life, her subtle differences from Maria and Roberto, the inexplicable pull towards art, the fleeting sense of recognition, it all coalesced into a devastatingly clear picture. Maria and Roberto had loved her unconditionally, but the truth explained so much. I can't imagine," Isabelle murmured, her voice laced with a mixture of awe and profound sadness. "All these years, and you felt it? Always," Eleanor confessed, her own tears flowing freely now. "A part of me knew. My heart just echoed for you." The conversation was not easy. There were moments of awkward silence, moments of raw, unfiltered grief for the stolen years, and moments of overwhelming tenderness as they discovered shared traits. A similar laugh, a mutual love for classic literature, an identical gesture when deep in thought. They spoke of their lives, carefully, respectfully, each woman learning about the other's world, the one they should have been a part of. Isabelle spoke of Maria and Roberto with deep love, making it clear that despite the biological truth, her affection for them remained steadfast. Eleanor, in turn, spoke of Clara, of the immense love she held for her daughter, the fear of how this revelation would impact her. The challenge wasn't just connecting with each other, but navigating the complex emotional fallout for everyone involved. Eleanor knew she would have to tell Clara, a conversation she dreaded more than anything. Isabelle knew she would have to confront Maria and Roberto, not with anger, but with questions and a need for their version of the story. The tentative steps were messy, filled with a fragile hope mixed with deep-seated pain and anxiety. Yet, with each shared story, with each discovered commonality, the invisible bonds that had always connected them began to strengthen, weaving a new, intricate tapestry of their shared, yet separate lives. It was a fragile beginning, but it was a beginning nonetheless, the sound of two hearts, long separated, finally beginning to beat in sync. The initial tentative steps towards connection between Eleanor and Isabelle were just the beginning of a profound and often challenging journey, not just for them, but for everyone in their orbit. The truth, once revealed, sent ripples through every established relationship, demanding courage, empathy, and an immense capacity for love from all involved. The goal wasn't to erase the past, but to understand it, integrate it, and ultimately to reimagine what family could truly mean. The most difficult conversation, undoubtedly, was Eleanor's with Clara. Eleanor approached it with a heavy heart, choosing a quiet, private moment. She sat her beloved daughter down, her voice trembling as she recounted the story, starting with her long-held, inexplicable feeling of something missing through the DNA test, and finally to the existence of Isabelle. Clara's reaction was a storm of emotions: confusion, shock, and then a profound, agonizing sense of betrayal, not from Eleanor, but from the universe itself. Tears streamed down her face as she struggled to comprehend that her biological mother was someone else, that the life she knew was built on a foundation she hadn't understood. Eleanor held her, comforting her, reiterating her unwavering love, emphasizing that nothing, absolutely nothing, could diminish their bond as mother and daughter. It was a long, painful conversation, but one that, slowly, began the process of healing and acceptance for Clara. Simultaneously, Isabelle faced her own delicate conversation with Maria and Roberto. She approached them not with anger, but with a newfound understanding and a gentle desire for answers. Their reaction was one of profound shock and deep sorrow. Maria, weeping, confessed the kerfuffle at the hospital, recalling the momentary mix-up with another baby in the nursery during a hectic shift compounded by the power outage. They had been assured it was immediately corrected, and in their overwhelming joy of finally holding their longed-for baby, they had dismissed the incident as a minor, quickly resolved error. The idea that Isabelle wasn't biologically theirs was heartbreaking, but their love for her was an immutable force. They embraced her, tearfully affirming their unconditional love and their unwavering belief that she was, and always would be, their daughter. The healing process was not linear. There were moments of immense joy, particularly in the growing relationship between Eleanor and Isabelle. They discovered countless shared traits: a dry wit, a love for classic films, even an odd aversion to cilantro. These small, intimate commonalities stitched them together, building a bond that felt both new and ancient. They spent hours talking, sharing stories of their separate lives, filling in the vast blanks of the years stolen from them. Eleanor recounted Clara's childhood milestones, and Isabelle shared stories of Maria and Roberto's vibrant family life. Each narrative thread woven into the other, creating a richer, more complex tapestry. The integration of the two families was a gradual, careful dance. The first meeting between Eleanor and Maria was fraught with a nervous tension, but also a shared, unspoken understanding of their unique, heartbreaking connection. Clara, initially reserved around Isabelle, slowly warmed to her, recognizing a kindred spirit, a sister born of an extraordinary circumstance. Maria and Roberto, in turn, extended their warmth to Eleanor and Clara, embracing the unexpected expansion of their family. There were moments of awkwardness, of course, as new boundaries were navigated and old assumptions challenged. Birthdays became double celebrations. Holidays involved careful scheduling, but with each shared meal, each shy smile, each moment of quiet understanding, the disparate pieces began to form a new, beautiful mosaic. The ultimate resolution was not about replacing one family with another, but about expansion and acceptance. Eleanor and Clara remained mother and daughter, their bond strengthened by the storm they had weathered. Maria and Roberto continued to be Isabelle's loving parents, their unique connection deepened by the truth. And now, Eleanor and Isabelle forged a powerful, unbreakable bond as biological mother and daughter, a relationship born of destiny and reclaimed love. They found a profound sense of peace in knowing their truth, in seeing the echoes of their hearts finally reunited. The once separate lives had converged, not without pain, but with an overwhelming sense of completeness. It was a testament to the resilience of the human heart, the enduring power of maternal love, and the incredible, often surprising ways in which a family, fractured by fate, can ultimately be reimagined and made whole. The echo of the heart touched upon themes of lost connections and rediscovered love. Do you have a personal story of an unexpected reunion, or perhaps a moment where you felt an inexplicable bond with someone new? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We love hearing how our stories resonate with you. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales that stir the soul and hit the notification bell so you never miss our next heartwarming narrative. Let's keep these powerful conversations going.